For 9 days in 1994, the entire world watched a mother weep for her missing boys.
I would like to say to whoever has my children that they please bring them home.
But today we're going to look past that performance. As a therapist, I'm looking for the clinical seams in that mask. I'm going to show you exactly where her performance failed and how a specific psychological trigger days before the crime made this tragedy almost inevitable. When we look at the Susan Smith case, we're staring straight into a psychological abyss that challenges our most basic understanding of human nature. The question that has haunted the public for decades, and the question we're going to answer today is, what makes a mother decide to end her child's life in such a horrifying way? We're going to analyze these questions from a perspective that you won't find in a standard true crime documentary. We're going to look at the exact moment Susan Smith snapped. But we're going to define that snap not as a loss of control, but as a calculated psychological shift. Now, let's go deep inside this clinical file. Most people think Susan Smith committed the unthinkable because she loved the man too much. They see it as a tragedy of desperation, a woman driven to the brink of rejection of a wealthy suitor. The media at the time often painted a picture of a woman driven mad by love. But as a clinician who has spent thousands of hours in the therapy room, I have to tell you the hard truth. It wasn't love that drove her car into that lake. Love, even if its most distorted forms, seeks to protect. What drove Susan wasn't love. It was a phenomenon that I call the narrative of the discard. In clinical psychology, we look for the empathy flatline. This is the moment where a person's ability to feel the pain of others completely vanishes because their own emotional survival, specifically the survival of their ego, is at stake. Susan Smith didn't take the lives of Michael and Alex out of a passion or the heat of a moment breakdown. No, she did it because in the darker theater of her pathology, those children had ceased to be human beings. I know it sounds diabolical. They had become psychological obstacles. I'm John Cordray, a licensed professional counselor. My entire career is built on seeing the truth behind the trauma. I work with people in their darkest hours, navigating the complexities of grief, personality disorders, and the mask people wear to survive their own lives. That experience gives me a unique clinical lens when I look at high-profile cases like this one. When we look at the Susan Smith case or the patterns we've seen in the more recent trials like the Black Swan Ashley Benefield case, we aren't just consuming true crime. We are performing a psychological autopsy, if you will. We are looking at the clinical architecture of deception. This architecture is built brick by brick through the years of avoiding accountability and using one's own trauma as a weapon to manipulate others. How does a person look a nation in the eye and lie about the most sacred bond in human existence, that bond between a mother and a child? How do you go on national television, as Susan did, and beg for the return of the children you know are at the bottom of the lake? To understand this, we have to explore a concept I call the externalized conscience. In a healthy individual, the conscience is internal. It's that still small voice that tells you when you've done wrong, regardless of whether anyone else knows. But for the person wearing a victim mask, the conscience is external. It's based entirely on how they are perceived by others. If the world thinks they are a good person or a grieving mother, then in their mind, they are that person. The externalized conscience is the key to understanding how Susan could sleep soundly while a nation searched for her children. As long as she was performing the role of the victim, And as long as the audience was buying it, her ego felt safe. She wasn't lying to us as much as she was maintaining the mask that protected her from the horrific reality of her own actions. She had successfully convinced herself that she was the one being victimized by circumstances rather than being the perpetrator of them. By the end of this analysis, you'll understand not just the what of what she did, but the broken psychological mechanism that allowed her to do it. We're going to break down the stages of the victim mask, from the initial trauma shield to the final narrative of the discard. We're going to look at why people like Susan Smith don't just snap in a traditional sense, but rather pivot into a new reality where people are merely pawns in their game of survival. We're going to learn why empathy, when directed at someone wearing the victim mask, can actually be a dangerous thing. Are you ready to see behind this mask? Let's dive deep into the clinical anatomy of the Susan Smith case. To truly understand the events that unfolded in the late October of 1994, we have to step back into the weeks prior. We have to look at what I call the pre-mask phase. On October 17, 1994, Susan Smith wasn't a woman planning a crime. She was a woman drowning in her own life. To the outside world, she was a young mother in South Carolina. But internally, she felt trapped by the walls of her marriage, the limitations of her financial status, and the daily, relentless responsibilities of motherhood. In my clinical practice, I often see clients who feel stuck. They feel as though their life is a series of closed doors. It's like Groundhog Day over and over again. But for Susan, this wasn't just a period of feeling stuck. It was an era of desperation. She wasn't looking for a way to improve her life. She was looking for an escape hatch. She was looking for a rescue that would wipe the slate clean. She believed she had found that rescue in a man named Tom Finley, the son of an owner of the company where she worked. To Susan, Tom wasn't just a romantic interest. He was a symbol. He represented the golden life, wealth, social standing, and a level of freedom that Susan had never known. She became obsessed, not necessarily with the man, but with the version of herself she could be if she were with him. In her mind, Tom was the key that would unlock the life of a status and ease, far removed from the messiness of her current reality. But on October 17th, that fantasy came crashing down hard. She received a letter from Finley that would act as a catalyst for everything that followed. This wasn't just a "we should see other people" note. No, it was a cold, clear, clinical rejection. In the letter, Finley stated plainly that while he liked her, he wasn't ready for the responsibilities of a ready-made family. He didn't want to be the father of her two young sons, Michael and Alex. Now, let's pause here for a second and look at this from a clinical perspective. In a healthy psychological state, an individual receives a rejection like this and enters a grieving process. It's painful, deeply so. They feel the sting of loss, they process the why, and they eventually move toward acceptance. I talk with clients every week who are navigating the wreckage of a relationship. They feel like their world is ending, but their internal self remains intact. But for Susan Smith, this wasn't just a breakup. This was a direct existential threat to her own self-worth. When a person lacks a stable internal foundation, what we call a solid sense of self, they don't just experience rejection, they become it. Susan didn't have the psychological tools to say, "He isn't the right one for me." Instead, she internalized this rejection as a final judgment on her value as a human being. When you focus so intensely on your own hurt, that pain becomes your entire identity. You stop being a person who is hurting and start being the victim. Every thought, every memory, and every future plan becomes filtered through the lens of that injury. This brings us to the core of the victim pathology. For most people, a victim is a temporary state caused by external events. But for someone like Susan, the victim mask is a defense mechanism used to avoid accountability, to maintain a sense of persecuted innocence. The mask requires a villain. And in Susan's mind, Tom Finland was the initial villain who rejected her. But very quickly, the role of the obstacle shifted. The most horrifying and terrifying aspect of this pathology is how it distorts the perception of others. In this moment of intense psychological crisis, a process of dehumanization began. In Susan's mind, Michael and Alex were no longer her sons, the children she had birthed and raised. They became the physical manifestations of the reason she couldn't have the life she wanted. They were the baggage that Tom Finley didn't want. And this is the exact moment the narrative of the discard was born. When a person is operating from a place of extreme pathology, their logic becomes binary. It's either or. There's no room for complexity, no room for how do I make this work? In Susan's distorted reality, she saw a clear divide. On one side was her life with her children, a life that she now associated with rejection, failure, and being trapped. On the other side was the life with Tim Finlay represented, the life of value, status, and freedom. In the binary logic of her victim mask, these two worlds could not exist. She didn't see a way to be a mother and also be the woman Finlay wanted. To her, the children had become a threat to her future. She wasn't necessarily planning a murder in a way a cold-blooded killer might. She was, in her own mind, removing an obstacle to her own salvation. Tragic. When the car went into the water and the police were called, the mask went up. The next 9 days, Susan gave a masterclass in what we call affective incongruence. This is when the words being spoken don't match the biological reality of the person speaking them. As an LPC, I'm trained to watch for the leaks. During the press conferences early on, watch her physical behavior.
And I pray that whoever has them, that the Lord would let him realize that they are missed and loved more than any children in this world.
True visceral grief is physically exhausting. It causes a collapse of the central nervous system. You see it in the eyes, the slumped shoulders, and the flat respiratory rate. But Susan's movements were directed. She was adjusting her hair between takes. She was checking the positions of the microphones. She was watching the investigators to see if her tears were actually landing. She wasn't in the grief. She was performing the grief. She used dissociative narratives, creating a movie plot villain or carjacker to redirect the focus. This served a dual purpose. It moved suspicion away from her, and then it reinforced her status as a victim. And here is the dark clinical truth. As long as the audience believed her, Susan felt like a good person. This is the externalized conscience. She didn't have an internal moral compass telling her what she did was wrong. Instead, she sourced her morality from the sympathy of others. The more people cried for her, the more she felt she had done nothing wrong. The sympathy wasn't a byproduct. For Susan, the sympathy was the reward. Now, we have to look at the turning point here. We've seen how Susan built this mask and used the nation's sympathy to feed her own ego. But there is a fatal flaw in that strategy. It only works as long as the audience stays in their seats. Investigators in the FBI had seen enough of that affective incongruence. They realized they weren't dealing with a grieving mother. They were dealing with a pathological performer. The moment an authority figure stops buying the performance, the victim mask doesn't just slip. It begins to suffocate the very person wearing it. We're going inside the interrogation room now to look at that very specific clinical double bind that forced the mask to shatter. We're going to look at why her confession wasn't an act of remorse, but a final desperate attempt at clinical manipulation. Interrogating someone with the victim mask pathology is vastly different than questioning a typical suspect. If you attack them, they retreat deeper into the victim role. But the investigators in this case did something brilliant. They didn't use pressure. They used clinical empathy as a trap. They sat Susan down and presented her with a double bind. They didn't say, "We know you did it." Instead, they said, "Susan, we know you're a good person who has been through an incredible amount of stress. We know that sometimes people under that kind of pressure do things they don't really mean to do." Clinically, this is fascinating. By offering her a way to be a victim of stress, they gave her a new mask to wear. They invited her to trade the grieving mother mask for the overwhelmed victim of circumstance mask, and it worked. This is exactly how to deconstruct the victim mask. The investigators played into her self-importance and her victim pathology and used it as a way for Susan to expose herself. If they tried to keep pressuring her, she would just use the same victim mask. This was likely feeding into Susan's narrative that she may get some leniency. But there was a catch. To wear a new mask, she had to admit the car didn't just disappear. She had to admit that she was there. And this is where we see the narcissistic collapse. When a person realizes their current lie is no longer sustainable, they don't move toward the truth. They move more toward the most logically, socially acceptable version of themselves. When the case moved into the courtroom, the victim mask evolved again. Susan's defense team attempted what I call a retraumatization defense. They brought up her history of childhood trauma and the loss of her father as the primary reasons for her actions. Clinically, this is a very slippery slope. As an LPC, I know that past trauma is a significant factor in a person's psychological development. But there is a clear distinction between explaining the behavior and excusing it. The defense tried to frame Susan as a victim of her own past. When her own history was discussed, the intense emotional response returned. She was able to cry for herself and her own losses. But when the focus shifted back to the boys, the emotional response became flat again. This is a hallmark of narcissistic injury. The only pain that feels real is the pain inflicted upon the self. This wasn't a woman suffering from a break with reality. This was a woman using her own history as a shield to deflect the reality of what she had done. I don't want to diminish or gloss over her abuse or trauma at all. That can alter brain functioning for sure. And if severe enough, can cause personality disorders or trauma responses. But it's unlikely that's what's happening here. When Susan finally confessed, it wasn't a breakthrough of the soul. It was more of a strategic rebranding. As an LPC, I pay very close attention to the language of confessions. Susan didn't just focus on the fear or the experience of Michael and Alex. She focused on her own darkness and her own pain. She framed the event as something that happened to her as much as it happened to them. This is what we call moral decoupling. She decoupled her actions from her identity. In her mind, she could still be Susan, the tragic figure, rather than Susan, the perpetrator. Even in her letters from prison years later, the clinical pattern remains the same. She writes about her suffering and her remorse in a way that centers her as a protagonist of the story. The children remain props for her narrative of redemption. The narrative of the discard is permanent. Even now, decades later, the psychology hasn't changed. Susan Smith has applied for parole, and her requests are almost entirely centered on her healing and how much she has suffered during her incarceration. In a clinical setting, we look for integrative remorse. This is when a person can fully integrate the horror of their actions with their current sense of self. They don't try to hide behind the stress or the man who left them. In Susan's case, we see a defensive remorse. Every apology is followed by a but. I'm sorry, but I was depressed. I'm sorry, but I was rejected. As long as that but exists, the victim mask is still very active. It's a way of maintaining a good person's identity while living the memory of a horrific act. This is a tragic finality of this pathology. The mask eventually becomes the only reality the person has left. Before we move to the final takeaway, I have to address a question that I get asked often. How can we tell the difference between someone who is a victim of circumstance and someone who is wearing the victim mask? It's a great question. Understanding this distinction is a difference between offering healthy support and being pulled into a cycle of manipulation. In my work as a counselor, I see people who have survived unimaginable horrors. True survivors often carry a heavy burden of shame, even when they've done nothing wrong. They tend to minimize their pain. They hide their scars because they don't want to be defined by their trauma. They're seeking genuine healing. However, the person wearing the victim mask, which is the pathology that we see so clearly in Susan Smith, is seeking something entirely different. They aren't looking for healing. They are looking for immunity. The victim mask is a strategic performance. And in Susan's case, she didn't just tell a story about a carjacking. She performed the role of a grieving mother to an international audience. When someone is wearing this mask, their trauma becomes their primary identity and their greatest weapon. They use it as a get-out-of-jail-free card. If you question their narrative, you aren't just being a skeptic. In their mind, you are the victimizer. This is why it's so difficult for investigators initially. Our society is conditioned, and rightly so, to protect the vulnerable. Susan tapped into the ultimate protected status. In human culture, a mother whose children are in danger, that's urgent. She used collective empathy of a nation as a shield to deflect the very real evidence that was beginning to mount against her. As a clinician, I look for what I call mechanical emotion. When a person is genuinely grieving, their emotions are fluid and often uncontrollable. But with the victim mask, the emotion often feels like it has an on-off switch. You might see a sudden fleeting look of duper's delight, which is a micro expression of satisfaction that occurs when a manipulator feels they have successfully controlled the room. I've talked about this before. They're subtle little rewards that the person with the victim mask feels. When we analyze the Black Swan Ashley Benefield case or the Susan Smith case, we're training our eyes to see these mechanical tales. The truth has a way of leaking out through the cracks in the performance. The Susan Smith case, while decades old, is far from a stagnant piece of true crime history. Instead, it serves as a foundational footprint for understanding the victim mask in the modern era. As a clinician, I see the echoes of this case constantly, not always in such violent extremes, but in the psychological architecture of how certain individuals navigate the world. We're living in a time where victimhood is often used as a form of societal legal currency, and Susan Smith was, in many ways, an early architect of this manipulation. The goal of the victim mask is to create a moral force field. Any action I take, no matter how horrific it might be, is merely a reaction to my perceived suffering. It's the same affective incongruence that we see in the courtroom and in police interviews. Affective incongruence is a clinical term for a disconnect between what a person is saying and the emotional vibe or physical expression they're putting off. In Susan's case, it was a frantic yet strangely hollow pleas for her missing children. In modern cases, there's often a performance of trauma that feels rehearsed, almost as if the individual is watching themselves in the mirror while they cry. It's this performance of the victim that doesn't quite match the clinical reality of someone who is actually experienced the trauma that they are claiming. As viewers and as a society, we often feel this in our gut before we can name it. It's our intuition. My goal is to help you name it. It's about being psychologically literate. When we understand the clinical anatomy of the discard, we stop being audience members for the performance and start being observers of the truth. And that's what I want you to learn, to be observers of the truth. Now I want to talk about the empathy trap for a moment. Empathy is one of the most beautiful human traits, but in the hands of a person wearing a victim mask, your empathy is a weapon that they use against you. They rely on your goodness to overlook their inconsistencies. They rely on your desire to help the underdog so that you won't look too closely at the facts. But we must learn that empathy is a gift, but it should never be a blindfold. Understanding the victim mask allows us to keep our hearts open while also keeping our eyes wide open. Susan Smith will likely spend the rest of her life behind bars, but the psychology that drove her to that lake in 1994 is still very much alive in our world. It's the psychology of objectification. This is a core belief that other people are not autonomous human beings with their own feelings, rights, and lives. Instead, they are used as objects or props that are only valuable as long as they serve a person's personal narrative. For Susan, tragically, her children were props for her role as a mother when it suited her, and they became obstacles to be discarded when her narrative shifted to being Tom Findlay's partner. When we see people today discarding friends, family members, or partners the moment they are no longer useful to their self-image, we're seeing a smaller scale version of the same pathology that led to the Smith tragedy. This leads us to the most difficult clinical question, and it's one I want to pose to you. Based on the concept of external conscience, where a person's sense of right and wrong is based entirely on whether they get caught or how they proceed by others, do you think someone like Susan Smith is even capable of genuine remorse? Remorse requires a solid conscience. It requires the ability to look inward and feel the weight of the pain you've caused another person. But if Susan viewed her children as objects, can she truly mourn them as people? Or when she cries today, is she mourning the loss of her own life, her own freedom, and her own reputation? Is she actually feeling the narrative of the discard in reverse, or is she simply performing the remorseful inmate mask?